Elizabeth sat on the worn couch in the living room, her eyes scanning the walls that had once felt like home. Now, everything seemed distant. The apartment she had helped provide for her son, James, and his wife, Rebecca, felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. The quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the otherwise empty space. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She had always been the one who cared. When James had lost his job a year ago, Elizabeth had been there, covering rent. When Rebecca's expensive tastes began to show, Elizabeth quietly paid for her shopping habits. She dipped into her savings, the money she had intended to keep for her own future, to make sure they had enough. But lately, something inside Elizabeth had been shifting. James had been distant, his calls more infrequent, his visits less kind. Rebecca, on the other hand, had grown more demanding, more entitled. Elizabeth had become more of a servant than a mother. She was expected to do things on Rebecca's terms when Rebecca demanded, as if she were nothing more than a maid in her own home. The breaking point came that evening, when the argument began, as it often did, over something trivial. Rebecca had asked for a new set of kitchenware, something expensive and extravagant. Elizabeth had quietly declined, reminding her that money was tight, that she was already stretched thin. But Rebecca wasn't used to being told no. The conversation escalated quickly. "I'm tired of this," Rebecca said, her voice rising with frustration. "You always act like you're some kind of martyr. Can't you just do one thing for us? Just one thing?" Elizabeth tried to stay calm, but her patience was wearing thin. She had worked too hard for this. She had spent years as a teacher, watching her students succeed while putting her own dreams aside. And now, after years of giving, of sacrificing, she felt like she was being drained dry by the very people she loved most. James entered the room, his tired eyes narrowing as he took in the situation. He'd just come home from another long shift at the coffee shop, a place where he'd been working part-time for months, barely keeping up with the bills. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice annoyed, as if it was Elizabeth who had started the fight. Rebecca, always quick to turn things to her favor, glanced at James with a sigh. "Mom's being difficult again. I asked her to help with the kitchen stuff, but she's acting like it's a huge problem." James shifted his gaze to his mother, and Elizabeth saw the disappointment in his eyes, that same look he had given her so many times before. She could see the subtle shift in him. He was siding with Rebecca, just like he always did. He didn't see her sacrifices. He saw only her refusal to comply. "Mom, just do it," James said, his tone cold. "It's not worth fighting about. Rebecca's right." Elizabeth froze. It wasn't just about the kitchenware anymore. It wasn't just about a sandwich or a favor. It was about everything. The quiet days of paying bills, buying groceries, all of it. The money she had given without a second thought. All those nights. She had worked overtime, sacrificing her own peace of mind to ensure they were comfortable. Her heart ached as she looked at her son, the boy she had raised with love, who now seemed so distant. She had been there for every milestone, every achievement. She had paid for his college, for his wedding, for his life. And yet, this was how he treated her. "Enough," Elizabeth said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm building inside. "I can't do this anymore. I won't do this anymore." James stared at her, confused. Rebecca looked at her like she had just said something absurd. "What do you mean, you won't do it?" Rebecca asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. "We've been asking for your help. We need you." Elizabeth stood up slowly, her knees weak but determined. She had made up her mind. The money, the time, the effort, it had all been for nothing if it meant she was only a servant in their eyes. "I'm leaving," Elizabeth said firmly. She grabbed her purse, walking towards the front door. She had already packed a small suitcase. Earlier in the day, knowing this moment was coming, James didn't say anything at first. His eyes flickered with a mix of confusion and anger. "You can't just leave," he said, his voice rising. "Where are you going? You can't leave us like this." Elizabeth turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. "I've given you everything." "James," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Everything I had, I gave. But you and Rebecca, you've taken it all, and I've had enough." With that, she stepped into the hallway, feeling the weight of her decision settling in. She heard James call out behind her, but she didn't turn back. This was it. She was done. As she walked out into the night, she felt a strange mix of fear and relief. The apartment, the life she had built for herself and her family, was behind her. She was walking into the unknown, but for the first time in a long time, she felt free. She pulled out her phone and withdrew $3,000 from her savings account, money she had been saving for herself. She would need it. She had no idea what was next, but she wasn't going to live as a doormat anymore. She had learned one thing tonight. Sometimes walking away was the only way to reclaim your life. Elizabeth didn't look back as she walked away from everything she had known. This was the moment she would take control of her own destiny, and nothing, not even her own son's guilt trips, would change that. Her life was about to change, whether she was ready for it or not. The departure. The streets were eerily quiet. As Elizabeth made her way down the dark sidewalk, the weight of her decision pressing down on her shoulders with each step. The city lights flickered above, casting long shadows on the pavement, as if even the street lamps could sense her uncertainty. But despite the quiet, despite the loneliness she felt, there was also a strange sense of liberation in the air. For the first time in months, Elizabeth could breathe freely without the suffocating weight of responsibility hanging over her head. The hotel she'd checked into wasn't much, but it was a start. The exterior was tired, its paint peeling from years of exposure to the elements, but to Elizabeth, it felt like a sanctuary. She walked through the entrance and into the small, dimly lit lobby. The woman at the front desk gave her a distracted nod as Elizabeth signed in, the familiar paperwork feeling oddly official. A room key was handed to her, and she trudged up the narrow staircase to her room, each step an echo of the life she was leaving behind. Once inside, Elizabeth set her suitcase down on the bed and stood there for a moment, surveying the room. The smell of stale carpet mixed with the faint scent of bleach from the cleaning supplies. It wasn't home, but it would do. Her gaze fell to her purse, where the $3,000 she had withdrawn earlier now sat. The money felt heavy in her hands, as though it represented not just a financial lifeline, but also the last tangible connection to everything she had left behind. She placed the cash in the drawer of the nightstand and collapsed onto the bed. The exhaustion from carrying her life out of the apartment finally caught up with her, and for the first time in weeks, Elizabeth allowed herself to close her eyes and rest. The next morning came too quickly. The early sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting a soft glow across the room. Elizabeth awoke with a start, her body stiff from the unfamiliar bed, but her mind already racing. The decision had been made. She was free, but what came next? The future seemed as vast and unknown as the world outside her window. She couldn't keep living in a hotel forever, but she wasn't sure what to do next. The only thing she knew for certain was that she couldn't go back. Not now. Not after everything. Elizabeth spent the rest of the day taking small steps toward reclaiming her independence. She made a few calls to her bank and credit card company, making sure all automatic payments had been stopped. She needed to ensure that James and Rebecca couldn't drain her accounts anymore. The last thing she wanted was for them to come looking for more money, thinking they could continue to manipulate her. As she sat in the small hotel room, Elizabeth opened her tablet and began drafting a list. The list was simple. Find a new place to live, figure out how to manage her finances, and, most importantly, learn how to stop caring about the people who had taken her for granted. It wasn't easy, but she knew she had to take control now. She had been taking care of others her whole life, first as a teacher, then as a mother, and finally as a financial safety net for her son and daughter-in-law. Now it was time to take care of herself. The thought of renting an apartment, getting back into a routine, seemed overwhelming. But Elizabeth had lived through worse. She'd lost her husband years ago and had raised James on her own. She could do this too. Maybe it wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself, but it was hers. No more would she live in the shadow of other people's expectations. In the following days, Elizabeth's focus was clear. She found a small, affordable apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. The process of signing the lease felt oddly empowering. For the first time, Elizabeth was making a decision that was purely for her. No one could tell her what to do, and no one could control her future. The thought made her feel a little lighter, as though she had shaken off an invisible weight she had carried for far too long. At night, she spent time organizing her finances, reviewing her savings and budgeting for the next few months. She had enough to get by, enough to start fresh. She didn't know how long it would take to truly feel free, but she was determined to make it work. Her life was in her hands now, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. But as the days passed, Elizabeth couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in her gut. She had left everything behind: her son, her daughter-in-law, her apartment. It had been the right thing to do, but the guilt still lingered. What would James think when he realized she wasn't coming back? What would Rebecca do without her constant support? She tried to push these thoughts aside, knowing they wouldn't help. She couldn't fix everything, not anymore. Then, one evening, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something told her it was from her old life. Hesitant, she picked up the call. "Mom?" The voice was unmistakable. It was James. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. She had expected this. She had known it was only a matter of time before he would reach out. "James," she replied, her voice steady but laced with a hint of sadness. "What is it?" I need to talk to you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about you leaving." Elizabeth felt a twinge of hope, but she pushed it aside. She had learned not to expect too much from these conversations. It had been the same story for years: guilt, manipulation, empty promises. This time, she wasn't going to fall for it. "James, there's nothing to talk about," Elizabeth said softly. "I've made my decision." "Please, Mom," he pressed. "I know I messed up, but we need you. Rebecca, No," Elizabeth interrupted, her voice firm. "I've given enough. I won't be your safety net anymore. You need to take responsibility for your own life." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Elizabeth could almost hear him processing her words, trying to figure out a way to fix things on his terms. But there was no fix this time. "I'm sorry," James said quietly. "I don't know what else to say." Elizabeth didn't respond. She didn't need to. The silence between them was enough. This was the end of the road for them, at least for now. The conversation ended shortly after, and Elizabeth sat back in her chair, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew one thing: she was finally free. And for the first time in a long while, Elizabeth allowed herself to smile. The new beginning. The next few days in the small apartment were a blur. Elizabeth didn't know if it was the novelty of her newfound freedom or the weight of her decision finally settling in. But each day felt like a new chapter in her life, one she had never imagined, but one she was determined to embrace. She spent hours cleaning her new space, trying to make it feel like hers. It wasn't much: bare walls, a small kitchen, a single bed that squeaked with every movement, but it was clean, and it was hers. As she arranged the furniture and unpacked The few belongings she had brought with her, a sense of peace began to settle over her. It was quiet here, in this apartment. The chaos of her past life, the constant tension, the emotional toll it had all taken on her, was now distant. It felt strange not having the constant background noise of Rebecca's demands or James's guilt-laden phone calls. The silence in the apartment was comforting, but it was also unnerving. For the first time in years, Elizabeth had no one to take care of, no one to worry about. It was just her. The days became a blur of small tasks. She walked around the neighborhood, familiarizing herself with the area, finding the local coffee shop and buying groceries for the first time in months. Elizabeth took the time to rediscover simple joys she hadn't experienced in years, like picking out fresh fruit without thinking about how it would be shared with others, or sitting at a table for one at a cafe without the nagging feeling that she should be doing something else. She didn't feel lonely, not at first. Instead, she felt an odd sense of contentment. The freedom was intoxicating. She was able to go to bed when she wanted, eat what she wanted, and spend her time doing things she enjoyed, like reading the books she had left unread for years. There was no need to ask for permission, no obligation to anyone. She could live for herself now, but the quiet also had its downside. As the days passed, Elizabeth began to feel the weight of the change. She no longer had the distractions of helping James or Rebecca. She no longer had the excuse of playing the role of the martyr. Instead, she had to face herself. And what? She was running from. The guilt was always there, lingering just beneath the surface. Had she made the right choice? Was it selfish to walk away from her son? Would they ever truly understand why she had done it? These thoughts gnawed at her in the stillness of the night, when the world outside her window was silent, and her mind wandered back to the life she had left behind. But every time the guilt crept in, Elizabeth reminded herself of the truth. She had given everything for them, everything she could. She had supported James and Rebecca financially, emotionally, in ways that had drained her. And where had it gotten her? She had been treated as an afterthought, as a servant, a lifeline. They took for granted. She wasn't anyone's punching bag anymore. She had learned to say no, even if it felt like a betrayal to the people she loved. One morning, after a particularly restless night, Elizabeth woke up with a renewed sense of determination. She was done with feeling sorry for herself. It was time to take charge of her life, to live it for herself. She was no longer defined by her role as a mother or a caretaker or a financial support system. She was Elizabeth. Just Elizabeth. That day, she signed up for a local art class, something she had always wanted to do but had never made the time for. She had loved painting when she was younger, and she had always dreamed of taking it up again, but life had never given her the chance. Now, she could make that dream a reality. She could do whatever she wanted. As the weeks passed, Elizabeth fell into a new routine. The art class became a highlight of her week. She learned to mix colors, to create shapes and textures, and to express herself in a way she hadn't in years. It wasn't just about the art. It was about reclaiming a part of herself that had been buried beneath the weight of obligations for so long. With each brushstroke, she felt more alive. But it wasn't just the art that brought her peace. Elizabeth began to reconnect with old friends, people she hadn't seen in years. They had always been there for her, but she had been too consumed by her responsibilities to truly appreciate them. Now, she made time for coffee dates, long walks in the park, and even weekend trips to nearby towns, for the first time in a long time. Elizabeth was building a life for herself, not for anyone else. Her finances, too, were beginning to stabilize. She didn't have as much as she had before, but she had enough. Enough to live comfortably. Enough to not worry about where the next paycheck would come from. She had learned to live simply, and in a way, that felt like a blessing. No more living paycheck to paycheck, no more scrambling to cover someone else's bills. She was free. Still, the quiet in her apartment felt heavier some days than others. As she sipped her coffee one morning, Elizabeth realized that she had been avoiding her phone for weeks. She hadn't spoken to James since that last call, and she hadn't heard from Rebecca at all. Her silence was intentional, but part of her still wondered if it was the right choice. Then, on a chilly evening in early November, Elizabeth received a letter. It was from James. She sat down on the edge of her bed, turning the envelope over, in her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly as she tore it open. The letter inside was handwritten, James's familiar scrawl filling the page. "Mom," it began. "I don't know where to start. I'm sorry. I know I've let you down in more ways than I can count. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, and I realize now that I've taken you for granted. You've always been there for me, but I didn't appreciate it until you were gone. I'm sorry for the things I said, and the way I treated you. I was wrong." Elizabeth paused, her breath catching in her throat. The words felt real, but she couldn't help the knot in her stomach. Could she trust this apology? Could she trust him after everything? She read on. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want you to know that I'm trying to do better. Rebecca and we're working things out. I'm trying to be the kind of person who can be there for you, not just take from you. I know I have a lot to make up for, but I'm trying." Elizabeth set the letter down and leaned back against the wall. Her thoughts swirled in her mind, a mixture of hope and skepticism. James had apologized, but was it enough? Would he truly change, or was this just another empty promise? Her fingers hovered over her phone, ready to dial his number, but something inside her held her back. She had walked away for a reason, and maybe it was time to let him make the next move. For now, she decided to wait. She didn't need to rush back into a relationship that had caused her so much pain, but she would keep the letter, just in case. It was a step forward, a small sign that maybe, just maybe, things could change. As the days turned into weeks, Elizabeth felt a sense of calm settle over her. She was no longer just Elizabeth, the caretaker. She was simply Elizabeth, free to live her life on her own terms. And for the first time in years, that felt enough. The revelation: it had been several weeks since Elizabeth had received James's letter. She had spent her time immersing herself in her new routine, art classes, walks in the park, reconnecting with old friends. Life was finally starting to feel normal again. But still, there was something lingering in the back of her mind. A part of her couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. That evening, as she was sorting through some old papers at her desk, Elizabeth's phone buzzed with a message. It was from an old friend, Linda, who had worked with her at the school for years. They had stayed in touch over the years, but their conversations had been brief. Elizabeth opened the message, curious. "I heard something today, and I think you should know. I don't want to get involved, but it's about Rebecca. You might want to keep an eye out." Elizabeth frowned, her heart beating a little faster. Rebecca had always been unpredictable, but this message made her uneasy. She quickly texted Linda back, asking what she meant. The reply came moments later. "It's nothing solid, just a feeling. But I heard that Rebecca has been using your credit card to buy things, expensive things. She returned some items for cash at Peterson's drugstore last week, and when they looked up the receipt, it was paid for with your card." Elizabeth's blood ran cold as the words sank in. Could it be true? Rebecca, who had always been so charming and sweet when she needed something, was using her card without permission? It didn't make sense. But then again, Elizabeth had noticed the signs. The expensive makeup Rebecca had been buying, the shopping trips she had been making, and the way she always seemed to have money to spare when Elizabeth had nothing left to give. Elizabeth had assumed it was just her living beyond her means. But this was different. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down. The betrayal felt like a physical punch in the stomach. She had been so generous, so willing to help, to provide. And this was how Rebecca repaid her? By stealing from her, behind her back? Elizabeth didn't want to believe it, but the more she thought about it, the more it started to make sense. The pattern was clear. Rebecca had been taking advantage of her in every way she could. She had manipulated her into thinking that she was just being a good mother, a good grandmother-to-be, but in reality, she had been draining Elizabeth dry for her own selfish needs. Elizabeth stood up, pacing the small apartment as the reality of the situation set in. She couldn't let this go. She couldn't allow Rebecca to continue to steal from her and get away with it. No more. The next morning, she made a decision. She would confront Rebecca, but this time it wouldn't be like the last time. This time, Elizabeth would be prepared. She would not allow herself to be manipulated again. But before that confrontation could happen, Elizabeth knew she needed to act. She wasn't going to wait for Rebecca to come to her and explain herself. No. This time, Elizabeth would take control of the situation. The first call was to her bank. She had to make sure that no more unauthorized payments were going through. After explaining her concerns to the customer service representative, Elizabeth was assured that her credit card would be frozen immediately and that a new card would be issued. The representative asked if she wanted to press charges, but Elizabeth hesitated. She wasn't ready to go that far, not yet. But she knew that this was just the beginning. Next, Elizabeth called her credit card company. The same process. She had to cancel her card and dispute any unauthorized charges. It felt good. To take action. To finally do something about the situation, instead of just waiting for something to change. Elizabeth had been too passive for too long. That afternoon, Elizabeth received another call, this time from her old neighbor Betty. Betty had always been a gossip, but she was also a good person, and Elizabeth had always trusted her. Betty's voice trembled when she spoke. "I don't want to get involved in any of this, Elizabeth," Betty said, "but I thought you should know. I saw Rebecca at Peterson's drugstore the other day. She was returning some high-end makeup and then walking out with cash. I overheard the cashier mention your name when they were processing the return." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. The evidence was piling up. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a fact. Rebecca had been stealing from her for weeks, maybe even months. "Thank you for telling me, Betty," Elizabeth said, her voice calm despite the storm raging inside her. "I appreciate it." Betty hesitated before speaking again. "Just be careful, Elizabeth. A woman who steals from family might do other things when she feels cornered. You know Rebecca, right?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. She had known Rebecca for years, and now she realized that she had never really known her at all. Her sweet, charming daughter-in-law was nothing more than a master manipulator. The thought made her stomach turn. After hanging up with Betty, Elizabeth sat down at her small kitchen table, the weight of everything bearing down on her. She had to confront Rebecca. She couldn't let this go. She would no longer be a silent victim. She was done being used. That evening, after a long day of phone calls and organizing her thoughts, Elizabeth sat at her kitchen table, looking out the window. The sun had set, casting long shadows across the city. The silence of her apartment felt strange, but it was peaceful. She was alone, and for the first time in a long time, Elizabeth was grateful for that. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from James. It was short, simple, and to the point. "Mom, please call me. I want to talk." Elizabeth stared at the message for a long moment. She hadn't spoken to him since the letter. She had made it clear that she needed space, but now, with everything else going on, she wondered if she was ready to face him again. For now, though, there were more pressing matters. She needed to deal with Rebecca, and that confrontation would come soon enough. Taking action, Elizabeth woke up the next morning with a newfound sense of determination. She had never been one to shy away from difficult conversations, but this was different. The knowledge that Rebecca had been using her credit card without permission weighed heavily on her. The feeling of betrayal was sharper than anything she had ever experienced. She had trusted Rebecca like family, and yet Rebecca had chosen to steal from her. Elizabeth knew she had to act, and she couldn't afford to hesitate any longer. She pulled her robe tighter around her, the morning chill creeping in, and sat down at the kitchen table. Her hands were steady as she opened her tablet, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she researched what steps she needed to take next. She had already contacted her bank and credit card company to freeze the accounts, but that wasn't enough. Rebecca had been getting away with this for far too long, and Elizabeth was determined to put a stop to it. She spent the next few hours gathering information. She called her lawyer, who confirmed that, while this wasn't a clear-cut case of fraud, there was enough evidence to take action if she chose to. The more Elizabeth thought about it, the more she realized that she couldn't just let Rebecca get away with what she had done. She wasn't just stealing money from Elizabeth, she was robbing her of her peace of mind, her trust, and her dignity. After she finished her call with the lawyer, Elizabeth sat back in her chair thinking. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about standing up for herself. She had given James and Rebecca so much over the years, and now it felt like she had been taken for granted. If she didn't do something now, she would be setting a dangerous precedent for herself. Elizabeth drafted a letter detailing the unauthorized charges on her credit card, the items Rebecca had returned for cash, and the way she had been manipulated into helping them financially. She planned to send it to James and Rebecca, hoping to get their attention. She knew it wasn't going to be easy, but she was ready for the confrontation. By midday, she had worked herself up enough to make the call. Her hands were sweaty, her heart racing. It had been weeks since she'd spoken to James, and she wasn't sure how he would react. But she had to do this. She had to make him understand what Rebecca had done. She dialed his number and waited, the silence on the other end of the line making her feel more alone than ever. After a few rings, James answered. "Mom?" His voice was hesitant, almost as if he hadn't expected her to call. "I didn't think you'd call." "James, we need to talk," Elizabeth said, trying to keep her voice steady. She could feel the tension rising in her chest, but she wouldn't let it control her. Not now. "It's about Rebecca." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Elizabeth could almost hear him bracing himself. "What about her?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. This wasn't easy, but she couldn't avoid it anymore. "She's been using my credit card, James. She's been making purchases and returning things for cash. I have evidence." James let out a sharp breath, and Elizabeth could hear the discomfort in his voice. "Mom, I don't know what to say." "I don't need you to say anything right now," Elizabeth interrupted. "I need you to understand that I won't tolerate this. I've been more than generous, but this goes beyond anything I'm willing to put up with. I won't let her steal from me anymore." "I didn't know about any of this," James said quickly, but Elizabeth could hear the doubt in his tone. "I didn't know she was doing that." "Well, she is," Elizabeth said firmly, "and it stops now." There was another long pause before James spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I'll talk to her. But Mom, please, don't do anything rash. Please don't go to the police." Elizabeth felt a surge of anger. "Don't you see, James? This is the last straw. I've given you both everything I could. I've sacrificed for you. And now, this? She's been stealing from me behind my back. I'm not going to let that slide." "I understand," James said, sounding defeated. "I'll talk to her, I promise." Elizabeth's grip on the phone tightened. "I don't want any more promises. I want actions. You need to make this right, James. And if it doesn't change, if she keeps taking from me, I'll do what I have to do." James didn't respond right away, but Elizabeth knew he understood. The weight of the situation was finally sinking in. She had drawn her line in the sand, and now it was up to James and Rebecca to decide what to do next. When the call ended, Elizabeth sat in silence for a moment, her breath steadying as the tension left her body. She had done what she needed to do. Now she would wait. But the waiting was the hardest part. She had been through so much in her life. She had survived the loss of her husband, the years of hard work, the ups and downs of raising a son on her own. She had always done what was best for her family, even when it meant sacrificing her own happiness. But this was different. She was standing up for herself now, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. Later that afternoon, Elizabeth received a call from her lawyer, confirming that the paperwork was in place to take further action if necessary. She would be able to pursue legal action if Rebecca continued to use her credit card or make any more unauthorized purchases. But for now, Elizabeth hoped that the letter and her conversation with James would be enough to stop it. That evening, Elizabeth sat in her small apartment, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the room. She was no longer the woman who had quietly endured years of manipulation and sacrifice. She was someone who had learned to take control of her own life, to stand up for herself when it mattered most. And no matter what happened next, she knew that this was the right path. She had finally found her voice again. The next step, whatever it was now in her hands. The confrontation. The following days passed in a tense silence. Elizabeth spent her time painting, reading, and making calls. To finalize her arrangements, the routine had brought her some comfort, but the undercurrent of unresolved issues with James and Rebecca remained. She hadn't heard back from either of them, and it gnawed at her. The silence was deafening, and each passing day only seemed to make the distance between her and her family feel wider. Then, one evening, as Elizabeth was sipping her tea in her quiet apartment, the phone rang. Her heart skipped when she saw the name on the screen, James. She hesitated for a moment, but then picked it up. "Mom?" James's voice came through the line, tired but determined. "We need to talk." Elizabeth's stomach twisted. She had been waiting for this moment, but now that it had come, she wasn't sure what to expect. She had hoped for change, but a part of her was still unsure. Still, she steeled herself. "Okay," she said, her voice calm but firm. "What's going on?" "I spoke to Rebecca," James began, and there was a slight hesitation in his tone. "She admitted to using your card. I didn't know, Mom. I didn't know she was doing that." Elizabeth felt a mix of emotions. Anger, relief, and disbelief all swirled together. She had known it was coming, but hearing him say it out loud made it feel so much more real. Still, she wasn't ready to let him off the hook just yet. "And?" she pressed. "What happens now?" "We're going to fix this," James said quickly, as if he could make everything right with those words. "I've already contacted the bank to make sure those charges are reversed. I'm going to pay you back for what she took. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right, Mom." Elizabeth closed her eyes, trying to stay composed. She appreciated the gesture, but something inside her wasn't ready to forgive just yet. "You can't just pay me back and expect everything to go back to normal, James. This is bigger than money." I know, James said, his voice cracking slightly. "I've been thinking about everything. I've been a terrible son. I should have never let it get this far." Elizabeth took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "I'm glad you realize that, but it's not just about the money or the credit card. It's about trust. You let Rebecca do this, and you didn't stand up for me. I've been giving, and what did I get in return? I've been treated like a doormat." "I'm sorry, Mom," James replied softly. "I was just trying to keep the peace. But I see now that I was enabling her. I shouldn't have done that. I promise I'll do better. I don't want to lose you over this." Elizabeth closed her eyes, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. She had raised James with love and care, and now it seemed like he was finally starting to see things her way. But the wounds were still fresh, and the road to rebuilding trust would be long. She wasn't ready to forgive him just yet, but hearing him take responsibility was a start. "I don't know, James," Elizabeth said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's going to take time. I've been hurt too much and I can't just forget that. I need space to figure this out." "I understand," James said quietly. "I'll give you that. I just want you to know that I'm here. I want to make things right. Please let me show you that I can change." Elizabeth remained silent for a moment, her heart heavy. It was hard to let go of the anger, to let go of the feeling of being betrayed. But she also knew that if there was ever a chance for healing, it would have to start with understanding and honesty. Maybe James was right. Maybe he had been blind to his wife's actions. But that didn't mean he couldn't change. "Okay," Elizabeth said finally, her voice soft. "I'll think about it. But I need you to understand, I won't tolerate any more lies. This is your chance to prove you can be the son I thought I raised." "I will, Mom. I promise," James said, the sincerity in his voice unmistakable. As the call ended, Elizabeth sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling around her. She knew this was only the beginning. There was a lot to work through, and she couldn't expect everything to be fixed in one conversation. But for the first time in a long time, Elizabeth felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. But she wouldn't rush it. She couldn't afford to. Later that evening, Elizabeth received another message, this time from Rebecca. It was brief, but its meaning was clear. "I'm sorry for what I've done. I know I can't fix everything, but I want to make it right." Elizabeth stared at the message for a long time before deciding not to reply. She wasn't ready to engage with Rebecca yet, not after everything that had happened. Rebecca needed to show, not tell. It wasn't just about the words anymore, it was about the actions. Elizabeth turned off her phone and sat back in her chair, the evening quiet around her. The confrontation had been difficult, but it had been necessary. Now, all she could do was wait and see if James and Rebecca would follow through with their promises. For now, Elizabeth had made her stand. And that, she knew, was the most important thing. The fallout, the days after the phone call with James, felt like a strange pause in time. Elizabeth kept busy, as usual, painting, gardening, reading, but the events that had transpired still hung in the air, unresolved. There was a sense of quiet anticipation as she wondered how long it would take for things to return to normal, or if they ever would. James had promised to fix things, to make things right, but Elizabeth knew that words were easy. It was the actions that mattered, and those took time to show. Still, she didn't expect things to change overnight. Trust had been broken, and trust took years to build, but only a moment to destroy. She checked her phone several times each day, half expecting a call, a message, or some sign of change. But for days, there was nothing. The silence was deafening, and Elizabeth found herself second-guessing everything. Had she done the right thing? Had she been too harsh? It was hard not to feel the weight of guilt, even though she knew she had been justified in standing up for herself. One afternoon, while Elizabeth was out grocery shopping, she bumped into Betty again, her old neighbor from the apartment complex. Betty was a friendly woman, always willing to lend an ear, but Elizabeth wasn't in the mood to gossip. She barely knew how to respond to the small talk Betty began, but then Betty said something that made Elizabeth stop in her tracks. "You know, I saw James and Rebecca the other day," Betty said, her voice low, as if she were trying to keep it between them. "They were arguing, loudly. It was bad. I don't know what happened, but Rebecca wasn't happy about something." Elizabeth's stomach tightened. She hadn't heard from James or Rebecca since their last conversation, but this news made her feel uneasy. She had hoped that the conversation would lead to some kind of resolution, but it seemed things were only getting worse. "I heard Rebecca's been blaming you for everything," Betty continued, her eyes darting around as if she were afraid someone might overhear. "She's saying you're the one who caused all this, that you're being selfish, that you kicked her out of your life. Elizabeth's heart sank. Of course Rebecca would turn things around and blame her. That was always the pattern. Rebecca had a way of twisting things to suit her own narrative, to make herself the victim. It was no surprise that she was doing it again. Elizabeth had known all along that this wouldn't be easy, but hearing it from Betty made it feel all the more real and all the more painful. "Don't let her get to you," Betty added, noticing the shift in Elizabeth's expression. "She's just angry because she can't control things anymore. And James, well, he's been caught in the middle, hasn't he?" Elizabeth didn't know what to say. She had always tried to maintain a good relationship with James and Rebecca, even when things were difficult, but now it felt like everything was falling apart. The person she had helped the most, the person she had given everything for, was now the one turning against her. Later that evening, as Elizabeth sat in her apartment, she stared out the window, her thoughts swirling. Rebecca's words, Betty's, news. It all seemed so unfair. She had tried so hard to be a good mother, a good grandmother, a good person, but all of it had been twisted into something else. Elizabeth had been taken for granted, used, and now she was being made the villain in this twisted story. The phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the name on the screen. James. She picked it up quickly, hoping for good news, hoping for a change in the way things had been going. But as soon as she heard his voice, she knew something was wrong. "Mom," James began, his voice strained. "We need to talk." Elizabeth's stomach turned. She had a feeling she knew what this was about. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. I don't know how to say this, but Rebecca's really upset," James said, his words rushing out. "She's been saying a lot of things, and it's causing problems. She says you've been taking advantage of her, that you're just using her for money." Elizabeth's jaw clenched. She had known this was coming. She had known that Rebecca would spin the story in her favor. But hearing it from James, hearing him repeat those accusations, felt like a punch in the gut. "I've tried to talk to her, Mom," James continued, his voice filled with frustration. "But it's like she's not listening. She's so upset. And I don't know what to do." "James," Elizabeth said, her voice calm but firm, "you need to stop letting her manipulate you. This is exactly what she's been doing to both of us for months. You need to wake up." "I know, Mom, I know," James said quickly. "But I'm stuck. I'm trying to fix things with both of you, but I don't know how." Elizabeth paused, her thoughts racing. She had spent so many years trying to keep the peace, trying to make everything work, but now it was clear to her that she couldn't be the one to fix everything. She had done her part. She had given everything she had, and in return, she had been betrayed, lied to, and manipulated. "James, I'm done," Elizabeth said, her voice soft but resolute. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep allowing you and Rebecca to use me and expect me to keep giving. I've sacrificed too much already." There was silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, Elizabeth thought James might hang up, but then he spoke again, his voice quieter. "I understand, Mom," he said. "I really do. I don't know what's going to happen, but I just want you to know that I'm sorry." Elizabeth sighed, the weight of it all sinking in. She wasn't sure if things could ever be the same, but for the first time, she felt like she was finally standing up for herself. She wasn't going to let anyone, no matter how much she loved them, manipulate her or take advantage of her. Again. "Goodbye, James," Elizabeth said softly, before hanging up the phone. She knew it wasn't the end of everything, but it was the end of something, and that was a start. As she sat in her quiet apartment, Elizabeth realized that the fallout was far from over, but she also knew that she was finally on the right path. Whatever came next, she was ready to face it head-on. She had taken the first step toward reclaiming her life, and no matter what happened, she wouldn't let anyone take that away from her. The legal battle. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls. Elizabeth was no stranger to dealing with bureaucracy. After all, she had spent years managing her own finances, handling bills, and making sure everything ran smoothly. But this time, it was different. This wasn't just about paying bills and sorting through statements. It was about protecting herself from the people she had once loved so deeply. She spent hours organizing everything: bank statements, credit card records, and the evidence that Rebecca had been using her credit card. Without permission, she gathered everything she could to build a case. It felt surreal, as though she were preparing for a battle she never thought she'd need to fight. But she was prepared. Elizabeth had learned one thing in the past few weeks. She couldn't trust them anymore. She couldn't rely on promises or empty apologies. Rebecca had crossed a line, and James had allowed it to happen. Now, it was up to Elizabeth to protect what was hers. Her lawyer had been quick to advise her on what to do next. The first step was to file a formal complaint outlining the charges against Rebecca. Elizabeth was told that while it was a clear case of unauthorized use of her credit card, it wasn't necessarily a criminal case unless there was more evidence of fraud or theft. That didn't stop Elizabeth, though. She wanted action. She wanted accountability. One afternoon, Elizabeth sat at her small kitchen table, reviewing the final draft of the complaint she would send to the police. The words on the page were a stark reminder of everything that had happened: the trust she had given, the manipulation, the theft. The thought of taking legal action against her son's wife made her stomach twist, but she couldn't ignore the truth anymore. She had to do this. For herself. For her own peace of mind. The next morning, Elizabeth drove to the police station. The cool morning air hit her face as she stepped out of her car, the weight of her decision settling over her. She walked into the station, the familiar smell of coffee and paper mingling in the air, and approached the front desk. The officer behind the counter greeted her politely, though his face showed signs of routine boredom. "I'd like to file a report," Elizabeth said, her voice steady. "I believe I'm the victim of credit card fraud." The officer raised an eyebrow, giving her a quick once-over before nodding. "Please take a seat. Detective Martinez will be with you shortly." Elizabeth sat down in the small waiting area, her mind spinning. She had never expected it to come to this, to file a report about her own family. But as the minutes ticked by, she reminded herself that this wasn't about revenge. This was about standing up for herself. She had been a doormat for too long. Now, it was time to reclaim her life. Detective Martinez arrived a few minutes later. A woman in her early 30s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She introduced herself, and after Elizabeth explained the situation, they moved to a small conference room to go over the details. "Do you have evidence of the transactions?" the detective asked, reviewing the documents Elizabeth had brought with her. Elizabeth nodded and handed over a stack of papers, detailing each unauthorized charge. "I've gone through everything. There are at least 5 purchases I know weren't mine, plus the returns." She exchanged the items for cash. "I have receipts and bank statements that prove it." Detective Martinez took the documents and scanned them quickly. "This is solid. We can work with this," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. "It looks like a clear case of credit card fraud, but we'll need to investigate further. We'll get in touch with the store to review the security footage and see if we can track the returns. In the meantime, I'll have a report filed and we'll proceed with the investigation." Elizabeth felt a small sense of relief. She wasn't just helpless anymore. She wasn't waiting for someone else to fix things. She was taking control. The detective went over the next steps with her, how long the process could take, what information would be needed, and what Elizabeth could expect in terms of updates. "We'll need you to sign a formal statement, and we may need to interview you again depending on how things progress. But I want to reassure you that we'll take this seriously." Elizabeth nodded, feeling a strange mix of anger and empowerment. "I just want this to stop. I want her to be held accountable for what she's done. We'll do our best, Detective Martinez said, giving Elizabeth a comforting smile. Don't worry, we'll take care of this. As Elizabeth walked out of the police station, the weight on her shoulders didn't feel as heavy. She had done what she needed to do. She was no longer just a victim in her own life. She was taking action. The next few weeks were a blur of waiting, phone calls, and more paperwork. Elizabeth stayed in close contact with Detective Martinez, who kept her updated on the progress of the investigation. Each time she spoke to the detective, Elizabeth felt a little more in control, a little more assured that she was doing the right thing. Meanwhile, she received occasional messages from James. At first, they were apologetic, filled with promises that things would get better. But as the days passed and the investigation continued, the tone of his messages began to change. He was frustrated, confused, and at times defensive. His messages started to feel more like demands for her to stop pursuing legal action than real apologies. One message, in particular, stood out. "Mom, please don't do this. We're a family. This is tearing us apart. Please, just let it go." Elizabeth stared at the message for a long time, her heart heavy. She knew it wasn't going to be easy to sever the ties that had held her family together for so long. But she also knew that she couldn't go back. Not now. Not after everything. She put the phone down with a sigh, resolute. James had to understand. She wasn't doing this to hurt him. She was doing it to protect herself, to protect the peace she had worked so hard to find. The investigation continued, and Elizabeth remained firm in her decision. There was no going back. The community's response. The days passed, and the investigation continued in the background of Elizabeth's life. She found herself checking her phone constantly, awaiting any updates from Detective Martinez. Each time the phone rang, her heart would race, but the calls were never from the detective, just more messages from James, filled with apologies and pleas for her to stop the legal proceedings. He was trying to reach her, but she couldn't bring herself to respond. The words seemed hollow, manipulative even, and Elizabeth was tired of it all. She had taken the necessary steps to protect herself, and now it was up to the system to handle it. But what Elizabeth hadn't anticipated was how quickly the news of her actions would spread through the small town. Millfield, the town where everyone knew everyone's business, was buzzing with rumors, and soon enough, Elizabeth was hearing things she never thought she would. One afternoon, she walked into the local grocery store and was immediately met with whispers. The checkout lady, Carol, gave her a tight-lipped smile, but Elizabeth could see the pity in her eyes. It wasn't long before Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman from the church baking committee, approached her in the produce section. "Margaret," Mrs. Chen said, lowering her voice as she came closer, "I heard about what happened. Is it true? About your son and that awful girl he married?" Elizabeth paused for a moment. She had known that the gossip would spread, but hearing it out loud was different. She nodded slowly, trying to keep her emotions in check. "It's true," she said softly. "It's been a long time coming, but yes, it's true." Mrs. Chen sighed, shaking her head. "I always thought James was a good boy. I never imagined he'd turn on you like this. You did so much for them, and now they're acting like this? It's a shame. You didn't deserve any of this, Margaret." Elizabeth gave her a small, appreciative smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen, but it's done now. I have to move forward." As Elizabeth continued shopping, she realized that the town was already buzzing with the news. Everywhere she went, people whispered, glanced at her, and offered her kind words. Some were sympathetic, some were more judgmental, but it was clear that everyone had an opinion. At the diner the next morning, she ran into Linda, her old co-worker from the diner where she used to work years ago. Linda had always been outspoken, but Elizabeth knew she could count on her for honesty. "Margaret," Linda said, as soon as she saw her, "everyone's talking about it. You're getting a lot of attention. How are you holding up?" Elizabeth sighed as she sat down across from Linda. I'm managing. It's not easy, but I did what I had to do. I couldn't let them take advantage of me anymore." Linda leaned in, lowering her voice. "Look, I'm not one for gossip, but you deserve to know this. Word around town is that Rebecca tried to return some expensive makeup at Peterson's drugstore. They said it was paid for with your credit card. Some of the cashiers were starting to get suspicious. They thought it might be a fraud scheme." Elizabeth's eyes widened. This was the confirmation she had needed. Rebecca's actions weren't just careless or thoughtless, they were calculated. She had been using Elizabeth for months, and now the town knew. "I'm glad you're standing up for yourself, Margaret," Linda continued. "But be careful. People like Rebecca, they'll stop at nothing when they're backed into a corner. They might turn on you even more, and if she's been planning something, it could get worse." Elizabeth felt a chill at Linda's words, but she remained calm. "I'll be fine. I've been through worse." The news kept spreading, and with it came a strange sense of empowerment. Elizabeth had always been a quiet, private person, but now she found herself walking with her head a little higher, her steps a little more confident. People in the town had always respected her, but now they were rallying around her. They understood her struggle, even if they didn't know all the details. At church on Sunday, the entire congregation seemed to know. Pastor Johnson, who had always been a kind man, pulled her aside after the service. "Margaret, I've heard about what's been going on with your family," he said, his voice filled with genuine concern. "I just want you to know that we're all here for you. You've done so much for this community over the years. You don't deserve this." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes welling up with emotion. "Thank you, Pastor. I've always tried to do what was right. But sometimes you just have to take a step back and take care of yourself too." Pastor Johnson smiled gently. "You're right, and you've earned that. No one here is going to judge you for standing up for yourself. You've been an example to all of us." As the days passed, more and more people reached out to Elizabeth. Some sent her cards, some stopped her in the street to offer their support. Even those who had never been particularly close to her were now offering words of encouragement. It was a strange feeling, but a welcome one. Elizabeth had spent so many years focusing on the needs of others, trying to please everyone, that she had forgotten what it was like to focus on herself. Now, she was learning to accept the support and kindness of others. She had never needed it before, but now it was the thing that helped her heal. The community, the people she had helped and who had helped her in return, were standing by her. They saw her strength, her resilience, and they respected her for it. Later that week, Elizabeth received a message from Betty, who had been keeping an eye on the situation. The message was brief, but it carried a weight of truth. "I don't know what will happen with James and Rebecca, but I wanted you to know that people are talking. They see what you've done, and they're proud of you. Keep your head up." That evening, as Elizabeth sat in her small apartment, reading the message, she couldn't help but feel a wave of gratitude wash over her. The town might have been small, but in many ways, it felt like a family. And while the fallout from her confrontation with James and Rebecca had caused pain, it had also allowed her to rediscover her strength. For the first time in years, Elizabeth felt like she was living her own life, not for anyone else, but for herself. She had made it through the storm, and now it was time to rebuild. And this time, she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. The final resolution. The weeks that followed Elizabeth's decision to stand firm were some of the most difficult, but also the most liberating of her life. As the investigation into Rebecca's actions continued, Elizabeth found herself more and more focused on rebuilding her life, something she had neglected for far too long. Her new routine was simple, but it felt fulfilling. She spent her days painting, taking long walks around the small town, and meeting up with friends she hadn't seen in years. The once empty corners of her life were slowly being filled with joy, peace, and new experiences. Elizabeth found herself laughing again, something she hadn't done in a long time. One morning, as she sat by the window in her new apartment, sipping her coffee, she noticed a text message from James. Her heart skipped, and for a moment she considered ignoring it. But then she reminded herself that she had made peace with the fact that her son had hurt her, and she wasn't afraid to face him. She opened the message. "Mom, I know we've been through a lot, but I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. I never understood the weight of everything you've done for us. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. I filed for divorce from Rebecca. I can't keep living like this." Elizabeth stared at the words, the heaviness of it sinking in. She had known deep down that James wasn't happy, but hearing this was still hard. Divorce. The end of the family she had worked so hard to create, so much sacrifice, so many memories. Yet, she knew it was the right decision. She replied slowly, her fingers pausing on the screen before she typed her response. "I'm proud of you for finally seeing the truth, James. But this is your life, and you need to make your own decisions. I'll always love you, but I can't go back to the way things were. I've learned to take care of myself now, and that's all I can do. I hope you find peace." The text sent, and Elizabeth put her phone down. The weight she had been carrying for so long seemed to lift just a little. She wasn't sure if things would ever be the same with James, but for the first time in years, she felt at peace with her decision. She had done the best she could. Now, it was his turn to grow, to learn, to live his life. Later that day, Detective Martinez called. The investigation into Rebecca's credit card fraud had been completed, and although Rebecca hadn't been arrested, the evidence was clear. The store had provided security footage, and it confirmed Rebecca's fraudulent returns. The legal team had recommended that Elizabeth file a civil case to recover the stolen money, but Elizabeth knew that this battle was over for her. She wasn't interested in dragging it out any further. Instead, Elizabeth thanked the detective for her work and decided that the matter would end with her. She wasn't going to seek revenge, and she wasn't going to continue living in the past. There was more to her life now, and she wasn't going to waste another moment on the people who had hurt her. The following Sunday, Elizabeth attended church as usual. This time, she sat in the front row, not because she was seeking answers, but because she wanted to be there, just for herself. Pastor Johnson approached her after the service, giving her a warm smile. "You've been through a lot, Margaret," he said, his voice gentle. "But I see you found your strength. I'm proud of you." Elizabeth nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle into her heart. Proud of you. It was something she had longed to hear for years, but now she didn't need anyone's approval. She was proud of herself. As she left the church that morning, Elizabeth took a deep breath, feeling the sunshine on her face. For the first time in a long time, everything felt right. She was free. In the months that followed, Elizabeth continued to build a life centered around her own happiness. She moved into a small lakeside cottage with a beautiful view, a place where she could finally feel at peace. She spent her time gardening, reading, and enjoying the simple things that brought her joy. The pain of the past slowly faded into the background, and Elizabeth found herself rediscovering who she was outside of the roles she had played for so many years. James called her every now and then, apologizing again, asking if they could have coffee. She agreed, but only on her terms. They met at the small diner in town, a place where they had shared so many meals before. Their conversations were awkward at first, but as time went on, Elizabeth noticed a change in James. He wasn't the same person who had taken her for granted. He had learned the hard way, and Elizabeth saw that he was truly trying to be better. It wasn't easy, but slowly, their relationship began to rebuild. It would never be the same, but Elizabeth was okay with that. She had found peace within herself, and that was enough. And so, Elizabeth continued to live her life, not for anyone else but for herself. She had reclaimed her dignity, And in doing so, she had regained her strength. The world was hers to live in, and for the first time, she truly felt free. As the sun set on another peaceful evening, Elizabeth sat on her porch, watching the sky turn a soft shade of pink and gold. She had learned that sometimes letting go was the only way to move forward. And in letting go, she had found herself again. The end.